So now we move on to the fifth keynote of Praxis. We have the global COO of V Communications. She's been with the company for 18 years and has worked extensively on the Microsoft business. Ladies and gentlemen, to speak on communicating for brands in motion, give a big round of applause to Jennifer Granston, Global COO of V Communications.
Am I on? Aha, thank you. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you very, very much for having me. I'm absolutely thrilled to be in India. And there's been a lot of talk over the last day and a half about chaos and uncertainty and all of these things that people are really trying to understand in a difficult operating environment for brands. And I hope that what I can do today is give you maybe a new frame or a new lens to look at this through. And it's one that we call motion. And so we started this and got really curious about this about a year ago, really starting to think about if we looked at this in a new way, really through the lens of brands operating in geographies, operating in categories, and operating amongst their stakeholders, how can we look at motion in terms of the way that we can understand that and understand how all of those things impact what they're doing every day? So it starts with this. So your environment is accelerated, and that's no surprise. We've talked a lot about the environment not being static, and it's accelerating by the day. And there's a few reasons for that, and these reasons are not totally new. They are things that have been around, and some bad news. You've never had control of your environment. So when you think about things like regulatory environment, think about waking up as a brand to a Trump election or to a Brexit, and how that puts you in this massive tailspin thinking about how you react to that. What does that mean to your brand? Economics, so currency, globalization, all of these things that are impacting and pressing on you from all sides. Competition, both the competition that you're aware of and that you're tracking, and maybe also the competition that you didn't even see coming. A great example of this is in the US. Amazon recently purchased this grocer, Whole Foods, and you have to imagine the morning that all of the other grocers in the United States woke up to that news and realized that suddenly they're competing with one of the most sophisticated technology companies in the world. You have to think about what that means as a brand operating in that category. Stakeholder desires, so all of the stakeholders that are critical to your success. Media, employees, shareholders, et cetera, they all have something that they're wanting from your brand. Organizational culture. And this is one that there's a great quote that many of you have probably heard about Peter Drucker talking about how culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it's this notion that your own inertia can get in your way, and you might have the very best strategy out there, but if you can't get out of your own way, it's going to make it very difficult to execute. Cultural zeitgeist. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, just the memes, the different things that are happening that you have to really pay attention to and really move and absorb. And then last but not least is crisis. So the things that can be happening at any moment that just throw your brand into a tailspin. So if you don't find that reassuring, there's some worse news, which is now you have even less control. So over the last decade, we have unleashed a monster, and that monster is consumer expectations. So when you think about what technology has done, especially over the last decade, the expectation is that with the mobile web, we can be anywhere. With cloud, I can access absolutely anything. And with AI, I can do anything. And you have to imagine the tremendous pressure that that puts on brands to react to that, because that expectation that I have as a consumer is impacting everybody, whether or not I think I'm a technology brand. So there's this wonderful quote. This is a former client of mine, Craig Mundy. It's out of the Thomas Friedman Thank You for Being Late book. And Craig talks about disruption and dislocation. And he talks about it in terms of disruption being something that happens to your business when somebody does something clever to make your company look obsolete. And then dislocation is something that's when the whole environment is moving so fast that everybody's feeling like they can't keep up. I think if you think about both what we experience as communicators and what all of the companies that we're working with as brands experience every day, you're somewhere on this pendulum of disruption and dislocation. So if you just think about some evidence, and I've got a couple, I think everybody has kind of their own experiences with this, but think about it through the lens of your expectations. So transportation. 5 years ago, I was perfectly happy hailing a taxi cab in the pouring rain. And then Uber came along, and then I wanted it on my phone, and I wanted control. I wanted to be able to nuke the driver if he looked sketchy. I wanted to be able to pay for it online. Then I started really caring about how are the drivers being treated. People like Juno come out, people like Lyft come out that are disrupting that industry. And now you've got companies like BMW and Volvo who are really starting to invest in autonomous driving. You have to ask, what is that new expectation going to be as that starts to come onto the scene? Communications. I had a flip phone. I will not bore you with how long ago that was because it will date me and give you a clue on how old I am. But the flip phone, I was so thrilled when I had that because you could reach me anywhere, and it was a wonderful thing. But then it was driving me crazy because I had all of these other devices that I had to carry with me for my music and my camera and stuff for my kids to do. So a smartphone comes along, and I can integrate all of that stuff. But then I want it faster. So my example of this and my exponential expectation is my flight on the way over here. And I flew Emirates, which is a terrific airline. I hadn't flown them before. And I find myself on Emirates, on their free Wi-Fi, on my phone, WhatsApping with my best friend in South Africa. And she's sending me photos of my goddaughter's 3rd birthday party. And I find myself getting kind of frustrated because the pictures aren't downloading fast enough. And I think to myself, okay, I'm in a metal box halfway across the Atlantic, hurtling across the atmosphere at 400 miles an hour, 40,000 feet in the air, and I'm pissed because my 19 high-resolution photos being sent to me from South Africa are not downloading fast enough, right? That is consumer expectations. And probably there's going to be a brand and a solution that fixes that the next time I fly. Last example is entertainment, and specifically music. So how many of you have boxes of old media, albums or CDs or old media? Yes, lots of hands. Everybody's got them, right? I've got boxes of media sitting in a storage unit that I am never going to open up again because I can't be bothered to download them and burn them onto my iTunes because I don't really care about that music anymore because everything is free now. And I was so thrilled when I could have Pandora and Spotify and it could link to my Sonos, and I was perfectly willing to pay for a subscription. But now the subscription model has to be called into question because even with Amazon, I can take and I can download 250 songs 10 minutes before I fly and head out to catch my airplane. I have control over the music. I can listen to the same song 5 times. I can curate exactly what I want, and I don't have to pay for it because it's part of my Prime subscription. So these are examples of this dislocation and this disruption that you're seeing that is causing everything to move so much faster, and brands are having to really pay attention to that. So with less control, does that mean more opportunity? We think it does, right? Because for brands that are really looking at this and understanding how to harness this and moving with this and looking at what's in their periphery and not just what's straight in front of them, it provides tremendous opportunity and entirely new ecosystems that are opening up. But it poses some questions. So first, are you propelling your brand? Is something or someone else propelling your brand? Or is it both? Because if your brand is being propelled through this chaos and all of this uncertainty and this environment that I just described, and you have no idea where it's going, and it's being carried forward in a way that you can't even really understand, that's a pretty scary position for a brand to be in. And so the key is really understanding how to take that motion and turn it into momentum that's positive for your brand. So this is the way we look at it. Do you like my pretty pulsing graphics? We worked really hard on this. So we talked about the 7 existing factors: disruption, dislocation, exponential expectations. I'm going to talk about the consumer view a little bit later, so we'll come back to that with the study and with the research. But really, the way we think about this is through a lens of motion. And the way we define motion is that motion is the relationship between these forces that are pushing on your brand and then what you're doing as a result and how you're pushing back on those. And what it calls into question is brand position, right? It calls into question the idea of traditional brand positioning, because that assumes that there's this static destination out here that you're trying to get to, and it doesn't take into account all of this other stuff going on out here. And so we look at it through the lens of brand motion, because what brand motion does is it reflects the realities of acceleration, disruption, dislocation, and then this monster of exponentially higher consumer expectations that, by the way, is never going to be satisfied. So what that brings us to are these 4 realities. I'm going to go through the 4 realities first, because if you understand those, they're kind of these universal truths that we were able to pull out of the research that apply to every market, every category, and every brand that we surveyed. If you can understand these, it'll give you at least a starting point to consult brands on what to do about this. And then I'll get into the study in a minute. So this first one is stability as an element of motion. And what I mean by that is when we ask consumers, do they see brands as being able to provide stability in this chaos, amongst this chaos? The overwhelming answer in every single market we surveyed was yes, absolutely. And the India data is right there. So I don't know if everybody in the back can read this. I'll just read a few of them out. So China and South Africa scored the highest at 90%, followed by US and Australia, pretty close. In India, 79% of the people we surveyed believe that brands can provide this. The interesting thing about India is that the way we ask the question a little bit differently of who do you see today providing that stability, the answer is a little bit different. So it's government, friends and family are tied, and then it's media, and then it's NGOs and business are tied. And so for me, if I'm a communicator operating in this market, what that tells me is there's this opportunity gap that you have a chance to really address with your brands, in terms of that people don't necessarily see brands playing that role today, but they're giving a huge permission slip for brands to play that role tomorrow and in the future. So stability can come in a number of forms, right? So I think with demonetization and some of the role that you saw brands stepping into and playing recently with that, that's a great example of stability. Same thing in the US with the DACA, with the visa issues that we've got. Brands are trying to get in and help government figure some of that stuff out. But stability can come in the form of like that familiar cup of coffee that you get from Starbucks, right? That wherever I am in the world and whatever is going on around me and whatever headlines I've read and whatever chaos is going on, I can count on this familiar cup of coffee that just is the same everywhere I go. So when you're thinking about how to apply this to the work that you're doing with your clients, think about looking at how they can provide a piece of stability. Okay, my second reality is that we found cutting edge is transcendent. So what that means is that when we looked at all of the data, we found that there was a really high relationship between anything that's perceived as cutting edge also being perceived as people loving it versus hating it, having high societal impact versus doing harm to society, and having an overall positive experience versus a misery. And if you flip that, it can tell you that anything that is viewed as being stuck in the Stone Age, people are probably going to hate it, they're going to think it's miserable, and they think it's doing harm to society. So this one's fairly obvious. When you think about the work that you're doing with your clients, think about how to lean into those innovation stories, whether it's in a product, whether it's in a business model, a delivery mechanism, those ways that you can perceive and show that what you're doing is really cutting edge, is going to resonate for consumers. And this was true in every single market that we looked at. The Unilever Effect. So over a decade ago, when Paul Pullman came on the stage, he took some big, bold moves, because he basically abolished shareholder guidance and quarterly earnings. And people thought he was crazy. And there was this huge uproar, and their shares took a dip. And he stood his ground and said, if you don't want to invest in the company, I'll actually buy your shares back. And then went on to set a pretty robust set of goals and objectives that Unilever was going to snap to over the next 10 years, or over the next 20 years, to really look at how they were going to turn their business into a more sustainable business model. And what we found is that when we look at the data, I'm going to show you the data for India as well, that when we ask the question of a product that provides great product functionality versus one that has a strong purpose or strong activism associated with it, that consumers overwhelmingly are looking for both. So all of these scores in every single market, and Germany, UK, Australia, and South Africa were the highest, with US, China, and in India. Still, that's the highest for them, not quite as high as the European markets. Second to that is a product that works. and then third, obviously, is a product that has purpose. So nobody's going to buy your product if it just feels good, but it doesn't work. But if I can have both, I'm going to have a leg up against anything else that is out there. Okay, my fourth reality is love you today, shame you tomorrow. So we looked at 40 scenarios across the 6 markets that we did the survey in, the 8 categories. And in every one of those scenarios, we asked the question of, do you love or hate this category, this industry? And in 54% of the scenarios, people loved the industry. But when we asked the question of, would you be willing to defend a company within this industry that steps out of line, 98% of the people said that they would publicly shame them. Okay, the lone smiley face up there is tech B2B in China, which is basically what we found to be the only category and the only market that has a prayer of being defended if anything goes wrong. So this sets up this really challenging situation for business and raises some really important questions around customer loyalty and what do you do in this environment where people are willing to shame you if something goes wrong, but they're not necessarily willing to advocate on your behalf. So where does that bring us? Brings us to you watching another pretty slide while I take a drink of water, and then I'll take you through the slides. Or sorry, through the study. All right, so I said we'd come back to the consumer view. So I'm going to walk you through the study. This is the last piece that is important to understand, is the consumer view in all of this. And this is the way that we got at that big piece that we need to really understand to be able to look at how all of this is pulling together. The study was conducted with our partners at YouGov, who did a terrific job with it. Our benchmark markets for this year were Australia, China, Germany, South Africa, UK, and US. You might have heard me mention some China data, or sorry, some India data along the way. And India was a pilot market for us, so we did ask some questions. We'll be running the full survey next year, and then this will be something that we look at annually so that we can get some good longitudinal data. We looked at 3,000 consumers in each market, 1,000 B2B decision makers in the B2B categories that we surveyed. The 8 categories, so computing devices, smart home, automotive, I'm reading them because I'm not sure how well people in the back can see. Health and wellness, alcoholic beverages, technology solutions for business or tech B2B, and then health solutions for business. And the way we set this up was really looking at a set of emotional and rational drivers. So if you can look at the consumer mindset and kind of pull apart those things that people are making decisions with their head and people are making decisions with their heart, and then look at that. And the way we set this up was we had 10 of those drivers being asked at the category level, and then 20 of those drivers being asked at the brand level. And we asked questions that gave us pretty polarizing answers. So if a brand was to disappear off the face of the earth tomorrow, would you scream that you wanted it back, or would you say good riddance? You know, if somebody stepped out of line, would you forgive them, or would you never forget? You know, so these very polarizing scales. And then with all of that data, what we did is set it up on a matrix, and we call this the motion matrix. And I'm going to step you through this because it's a good frame whether or not you have the data to be able to speak to clients about it. So all of these drivers and all of the results that we had, we looked at it in terms of 4 quadrants. So the things that scored high in rational and high in emotional, those are called movers. And those are both brands and categories that are really harnessing that motion and using that to propel themselves forward. They might be market leaders. You know, they're doing a great job of like really getting at the hearts and minds of the consumer. They can't rest on their laurels because the competition might come out and knock them out or dislocate them. So they have to keep ahead of what's going on, but they're in a good position. Defenders are what we call those with lower emotional and higher rational. And we found that a lot of those can be found in kind of low margin, high value, or highly regulated industries. Those kind of stalwarts. And maybe they don't really care if they have a lot of love for what they're doing. Maybe people are kind of stuck with them no matter what. but those are ones where probably if you're going to have a crisis, you're going to be a little bit more vulnerable because you're not going to have as much customer loyalty. Our agitators are the ones that have high emotional scores, low rational scores. And so those might be somebody with like a really new, exciting business proposition, a new emerging category. There's a lot of love and a lot of excitement for what's going on, but maybe not a proven business model yet. And then last but not least are our survivors. So those are low on both. And it's not necessarily bad to be a survivor. I mean, I think in some ways it gives you this huge permission slip to take a lot more risk because you kind of know, I mean, unless you're on the bottom end of the survivor map, it's going to give you this permission slip to take risk that you might not otherwise have. And you're probably going to know that you need to do something different in order to continue to stay relevant. In some ways, I think the worst place to be might be in that middle. And we've kind of fondly referred to this as the vortex because you're kind of nothing to nobody. And you've got enough currency in the upper part that you don't want to lose that, but not enough where you're willing to take big, bold risks. So the second thing to understand is different starting places for the markets. So what we found when we mapped all this data out is that we had very different things going on in the markets that we looked at. So China and South Africa have very, very optimistic markets. Australia and US, kind of a little bit more cautious, not super negative, but a little bit more cautious. And then Germany and the UK were very skeptical. And so the results, we had to kind of smooth those out. And what we found is that in a place like China, a place like South Africa, the degree of difficulty was much lower to be in that mover quadrant versus in the UK and in Germany. So once we were able to smooth out the data, and you didn't know there was going to be a geography test, but we've got UK, South Africa, we've got China, Germany, Australia, and the US. Then we were able to start to map across markets and look at some similarities and difference. So I'm going to take you through a couple of these, and then Gaurav is going to come join me on stage for a little bit of a Q&A after. So the first thing we noticed is that in all the markets that we looked at, computing devices was a mover. And a lot of that was driven by both high emotional, high rational, so a lot of love for the category, a lot of defense of the category, a lot of intent to purchase, a lot of necessity. People love their devices. I mean, you can come up with all sorts of reasons why that is, but companies operating in this category have a lot more leeway just because of the general positivity of the category in and of itself. Second is tech B2B. So they were also pretty much a mover in all markets that we looked at, with the exception of the UK, where it's an agitator. A lot of strength in the tech B2B. And these were business decision makers that we surveyed on these. So when we looked at defense of a category, we saw more defense of tech B2B across any of the categories that we looked at, where people are willing to come to its defense, which is it's great news for companies operating in this space. The next one is finance and banking, and they're in a bit of a tougher spot. So they showed up as a defender in most markets. And there's almost this hostage situation going on where people need them. So intent to purchase and necessity, all of those scored very, very high, but people hated them and misery to work with, and all of these things that show that people feel very hostage by the fact that they're having to use these companies. And it shows that I think there's a lot of opportunity for disruption in that category for companies that are operating in this category. I think that's going to be an interesting one to watch. Oops, sorry. I'll tell you about my last one, which was automotive. So automotive was the one that scored in the survivor bucket for every single market that we looked at. And I bumped into some gentlemen from Renault in the elevator yesterday, and I'm very, very sorry to inform you that you're sitting in the survivor bucket, but I don't know that it would be a massive surprise to people operating in the automotive space. I think you're seeing companies take big looks at their business model in terms of, are they automotive companies, are they mobility companies, how are things like societal harm and necessity going to impact, as different generations start to think a little bit differently about how they're using automotive. So it'll be another interesting one to watch. So I'm going to wrap up with this. First of all, disruption and dislocation. It is here to stay. And we all have to just get comfortable with it and not try to control it, but just to move with it and understand what to do. Secondly, position is given way to motion. So stop obsessing over this destination out here and really start to look at those things around you and really start to look at it through a lens of motion. The new realities, so regardless of what space you're operating in, these things are going to apply to just about everybody that you're talking to. So think about how your clients can offer stability, how you can position things as cutting edge, how you can look at that blend of purpose and functionality, and then how you can think differently about customer loyalty and about this environment that you have where people are so willing to throw you under the bus if you do something wrong. And then last but not least, that matrix that I showed you, even without any data, even without knowing the category data, which is all on our website, by the way, you can have a look at it. Even without knowing brand data, you can start to have really interesting conversations about where you think things might be, and it gives a good frame to start to understand all of that movement and a good starting place to start to have conversations about maybe what to do about it. So with that, I'm finished. And we're going to have Gaurav come up. Yeah?
That's good. Thank you so much, Jennifer. We're going to call in Gaurav Bhaskar from Google. Gaurav, over to you. Are you on?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, that was a great presentation.
Thank you.
So is this your first Praxis?
It is my first Praxis.
I think Praxis is the brand in motion.
Praxis is Amit is a man in motion.
This is my first time as well, and we have a packed house after lunch. That's not happened before. So thank you for joining us. You know, when I first looked at your framework and I thought about it, I've been with Google for 8.5 years, and we've been through a lot of changes as the world around us has evolved. And I could map Google on that framework. You know, we used to be a web-first company, then we moved to a mobile-first company, and today we are an AI-first company. And you can really map the changes that are happening and you know, how the consumers are reacting to it. India is unique in that manner. You looked at data in US and you looked at South Africa. I think if you really look at understanding the India market, you will find many countries within India. If you look at the first 100 million users, you know, people who live in the urban cities, their behavior is at par with what you see in US or UK or any of the developing economies. But it's really when you go beyond the first 100 million, you start seeing different expectations, different behavior, different needs. And that's where we see most of the, you know, brands struggle. So yes, you are a tech brand and you can easily get from, you know, starting with 0 to 100 million users very quickly. And then scaling beyond that really becomes difficult. And that's at least in the technology world. But there are a lot of brands in India who are now really struggling with, and you know, most of our colleagues here who work in that space with traditional brands or telecom or technology, auto, you know, textile and retail. And we work with a lot of these clients in our industry as a business. And 5 years ago, when we were having this conversation with them, they would just not engage with us. But last 3 years, India has changed quite a lot. You know, India is a country in motion. The consumers embracing technology. They want the best.
Yeah.
They don't want to pay you for that much. But so, how do you really see as PR and communication professional helping at least the defender brands move up to a place where the consumers really love and embrace them as the brand starts, you know, moving towards that, making the journey?
Well, so the first thing I would say, because I want to go back to what you said at the beginning around Google, we actually did do a little bit of mapping. And if I had to put Google on the map in India, it would be a mover and pretty high up, potentially surpassing the category.
Oh, thank
so
you.
I just, for what it's worth, and you guys I think are doing a terrific job with a lot of your advertising and a lot of the work that you're doing of really getting at that rational and that emotional for people. But in terms of defender brands, I think you have to think first about what you're trying to achieve as a brand, because being in one of those quadrants doesn't necessarily indicate a good or a bad thing, right? And so you might be a defender brand that's perfectly happy with your position, and you don't need a lot, or maybe you don't even want a lot of, you know, that customer love and that loyalty. I mean, I think about a company like an ADP or something in the States, which is cutting all of the paychecks almost for every employee, and they take this little tiny percentage off of every transaction that they do. They are perfectly comfortable with that. So they don't need to have a lot of people know what they're doing, and they don't need to have a lot of people love them. But if you think about, and we had this interesting conversation with the CMO of Kentucky Fried Chicken at Cannes, and she was just kind of looking at the matrix and self-identifying and talking about how she sees that brand as a defender in some markets and a survivor in some markets. And you can see some of the marketing that they've done to really try to reinvent themselves and get people really excited about what they're doing, and they're taking a lot of risks in doing that and kind of being funny and using humor to really engage customers. And so I think it really depends, though, on what you're trying to achieve.
So take risks. Well, that's learning number one. I mean, we really try and push ourselves every day to take new risks, try different ways of doing things. Most often we fail, but when we succeed, we succeed. So I think that's something which is common to us. We're seeing a lot of brands try different things. The other part I wanted to discuss with you, India is, incredibly positive about using technology as an opportunity of economic growth and development. And we have about, roughly around 5,000 startups in our country. And they're really defining what's next. While, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, they really are platform players, and they're really opening up these opportunities for everyone. But it's the startups that are really solving for the local needs, and they're solving for the users. And they're in that agitated space where they get instant traction with the user because they really have appeal and solve something for the user. How do communicators really take them from being, a brand that has got traction to becoming a credible brand? We see a lot of these new startup brands emerge, but they really struggle to kind of then, move to the next level. Any examples or any thoughts there?
I think being in a startup environment is a terrific place to be, and I think you're exactly right that you're going to see a lot of brands sitting in that agitator quadrant that are probably, in that startup space. And I think it might be a really great place to be for a while, because you might be bringing a category along, an entire category along, or a new business proposition, or being the one that's disrupting and dislocating everybody else. I think of Airbnb, for a long time, they probably sat in that bucket. And again, I don't have brand data to back it, but I can just hypothesize. They probably sat as an agitator, driving the rest of the travel industry nuts for a long time. But I think as you started to look at the business model there, they're proving a business model. And I'd say, if I had to make a guess, I'd guess that they're probably sitting more as a mover now. And I think it's looking at how you start to show that staying power over time. Because I think the dangerous part about being in that agitator bucket for too long is that if you can't show a proven business model, your shareholders, your investors, whoever it is, they're only going to give you so much license to just hang out and excite everybody for so long.
Great. So, we see that happening with new age media companies. A lot of our journalists who've spent a lot of time in traditional media now, venturing out, starting their own firms, and they're finding success slowly. The startup environment is a little constrained for funds this year, but wasn't the case last year. But love you today, shame you tomorrow is a reality that every brand lives with, and there is no right way to deal with it, right? Because at least when we look at it, we have over 8 products with 1 billion users. You can't make everyone happy. Although Praxis is a different case, everybody's very happy with it.
Everybody's happy.
How do you really tackle that? We haven't cracked it. I'm sure other brands struggle with it. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and you and I talked about this earlier, just in terms of that kind of love you today, shame you tomorrow, and also thinking about the question around purpose and functionality. And you and I had talked about this question of what's the relationship between those two? Because you've got a lot of different people you're trying to satisfy and make happy in this. And I think the core is for brands to really understand, who their audience is and who they're trying to speak to and who they're trying to sell to, and really get at the core of what that consumer mindset is. And that's going to vary probably by market, by demographic. I think that the days of looking at these wide swaths of demographic data are probably over. We have to be a lot more micro-targeted in what we're doing. But I think of Starbucks as a great brand that has figured out how to weather that pretty well. because they're so core to their values on who they are as a company, and that snaps to and resonates with their employees, and that snaps to and resonates with their customers, and they can afford to be out there and be very, very bold, taking positions that are not going to be popular with a lot of other people. And I think they've kind of decided they don't really care about the shaming that they might get from the people that are maybe not aligned with their values, but they're still out there really taking a stand, and it's done wonderful things for their business. But I think the key is being responsible in how you do that, and really understanding what you need to communicate and what you need to stand for as a business, and making sure that you're really, really clear about those audiences so that you're clear and understand, because there's going to be some people that agree with you and some people that don't.
Yeah, so really define your audience and create wonderful experiences which are stable. You use Starbucks as one example. So at that point, I want to just kind of open it up to the audience as well. I know this dilemma is for all of us to deal with on a daily basis. How do you really tackle the beast of social media? The changing landscape of media. There is digital media, then there is print, and there is fake news and things like that. But let's not make it about fake news. But happy to kind of take your questions and discuss further along this topic of brands in motion.
Gaurav, this is the post-lunch session. So
Oh, I thought they were engaged audience.
yeah, they were, okay.
Post-lunch, pre-coffee, right?
All right, then. In that case, Jennifer is going to be around. She's really looking forward to meet you all. And if you have more questions for me or her, and how to really use this framework. I mean, we've all used SWOT analysis at some point at a time. We still use it. But I think this is a wonderful framework which doesn't really require a lot of data for you to really map your brand and see what are the few things you want to try out in a short span of time and see how you land them. This is a great time for the industry to try out different things because the pace of change is so much. If you don't really try, you will be stuck and become irrelevant. And we've seen that happen with BlackBerry.
So many
other brands.
So
right?
many brands.
So, yeah, sure.
Hi, Jennifer. I just wanted to know, are you able to give us some specific brands that are in each of those quadrants? Because that also helps us understand who is where. So,
Call me. No, we're not. We're not releasing
Oh, you're
brand
not?
data
Okay.
publicly. Yeah, but we do have. So we looked at just for our benchmark here, about 30 brands per market, and then a number of those brands spanned across all markets. And so we do have that, and then we've got a way to kind of pulse additional brands, kind of like what I did for Gaurav.
Oh, good.
But yeah, you're right. And I think what we'll end up doing, this is the first year that we're doing it, we'll probably start to look at how we can blind brands so that we can at least pull some of that brand data out. And I think that's a good point. That'll help continue to drive it.
Yeah.